Good morning, everybody. How are we all doing today? It's another Funky Bunch at Sunday Brunch Podcast coming at you live on a nice Sunday morning. Are we ready to continue our discussion on video game genres and their subgenres? To review, what we did last time was we looked at overall what the theme of what an action game is, which is the current genre we're doing. And for a quick overview, an action game emphasizes physical challenges that require hand-eye coordination and motor skill to overcome. They center around the player, who is in control of most of the action. Most of the earliest video games were considered action games. Today, it is still a vast genre covering all games that involve physical challenges. And then we looked at one subgenre of that action game, which is the platform or platformers, which have gameplay primarily centered around jumping and climbing to navigate the player's environment. They may have enemies or obstacles to avoid and fight, or may just be pure jumping puzzles. Generally, the playable character in a platform game are able to jump many times their own height, and the players offered some control over the movement in midair as well as the height and distance of their jumps. Settings tend to be vertically exaggerated with much uneven terrain that the player can leap up or fall off of. So that's what we did last week. This week we're going to be looking at a couple more, hopefully. But first up is the shooter. Hope you all have your coffee because we're going to want to be nice and awake for this. So, shooter games are a subgenre of an action video game, which often tests the player's spatial awareness, reflexes, and speed in both isolated, single-player, or networked multiplayer environments. Shooter games encompass many subgenres themselves that have the community of focusing on the actions of the avatar engaging in combat with a weapon against both code-driven NPCs or other avatars controlled by other players. Usually this weapon is a firearm or some sort of other long-range weapon, and can be used in combination with other tools such as grenades for indirect offense, armor for additional defense, or accessories such as telescopic sights to modify the behavior of the weapons. A common resource found in many shooter games is ammunition, armor, or health, or upgrades which augment the player character's weapons. Most commonly, the purpose of a shooter game is to shoot the opponents and proceed through missions without the key player being killed or dying as a result of the player's actions. A shooting game is a genre of video game where the focus is almost entirely on the defeat of the character enemies using the weapons given to the player. So, the subgenres. So first up is the shoot 'em up, also known as the shmup or STG. I've never heard of a shoot 'em up referred to as a shmup, but you know what? Okay, it's a subgenre of video games within the shooter subgenre of the action genre. So it's a subgenre. There's no consensus as to which design elements compose a shoot 'em up. So, exactly, a shmup. That's exactly how it's spelled. Some restrict the definition to games featuring spacecraft and certain types of character movement. Others allow a broader definition, including characters on foot and a variety of perspectives. The genre's roots can be traced back to Space War, one of the earliest computer games developed in 1962. The shoot 'em up genre was later established by the hit arcade game Space Invaders, which popularized and set the general template for the genre in 1978. The genre was then further developed by arcade hits such as Asteroids and Galaxian in 1979. Shoot 'em ups were popular throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. In the mid 1990s, shoot 'em ups became a niche genre based on design conventions established in the 1980s and increasingly catered to specialist enthusiasts, particularly in Japan. Bullet hell games are a subgenre that feature overwhelming number of enemy projectiles, often in visually impressive formations. So, a shoot 'em up is a game in which a protagonist must combat a large number of enemies by shooting at them while dodging their fire. The controlling player must rely primarily on reaction times to succeed. Beyond this, critics differ on exactly which design elements constitute a shoot 'em up. Some restrict the genre to games featuring some kind of a craft, using fixed or scrolling movement. Others widen the scope to include games featuring such protagonists as robots or humans on foot, as well as including games featuring on rails or into the screen and run and gun movement. Mark Wolf, I don't know who he is, restricts the definition to games featuring multiple antagonists, M, like shoot M up, M being short for them, calling games featuring one-on-one shooting combat games. Formerly, critics described any game where the primary design element was shooting as a shoot 'em up, but later shoot 'em ups became a specific inward-looking genre based on design conventions established in the shooting games of the 1980s. So, looking at the common elements, these games are usually viewed from a top-down or a side view, and the player must use ranged weapons to take action at a distance. The player's avatar is typically a vehicle or spacecraft under constant attack. Thus, the player's goal is to shoot as quickly as possible at anything that moves or threatens them to reach the end of a level with a boss fight. In some games, the player's character can withstand some damage or a single hit. In some games, the player characters can withstand some damage, or a single hit will result in their destruction. The main skills required in shoot 'em ups are fast reactions and memorizing enemy attack patterns. Some games feature overwhelming numbers of enemy projectiles, and the player has to memorize their patterns to survive. These games belong to one of the fastest-paced video game genres. Large numbers of enemy characters programmed to behave in an easily predictable manner are typically featured. These enemies may behave in a certain way dependent on their type or attack and formations that the player can easily learn to predict. The basic gameplay tends to be straightforward with a variety of weapons. Shoot 'em ups rarely have realistic physics. Characters can instantly change directions with no inertia, and projectiles move in a straight line at a constant speed. The player characters can collect power-ups, which may afford the character greater protection, an extra life, health shield, or upgraded weaponry. Different weapons are often suited to different enemies, but these games seldom keep track of ammunition. As such, players tend to fire indiscriminately, and their weapons only damage legitimate targets. Alright, so the different kinds of shoot 'em ups. There's the fixed shooter, such as Space Invaders. This will restrict the protagonist to a single axis of motion, i.e. the x-axis, just moving left and right. Enemies attack in a single direction. They descend from the top of the screen, and each level is contained within a single screen. Atari's Centipede is a hybrid in that the player can move freely, but the movement is constrained to a small area at the bottom of the screen, and the game otherwise meets the fixed shooter definition. Tube shooters feature craft flying through an abstract tube, such as Tempest or Gyrus. There is still a single axis of motion, making these a subset of fixed shooters. There's the rail shooter, which limits the player to moving around the screen while the game follows a specific route. These games often feature an into-the-screen viewpoint, with which the action is seen from behind the player character and moves into the screen, while the player retains control over dodging. So some examples would be Space Harrier, Captain Skyhawk, Starblade, Star Wars Rebel Assault, Panzer Dragoon, Time Crisis, The House of the Dead, Star Fox 64, and Sin and Punishment. Light gun games that are on rails are not in the shoot 'em up category, but the first-person shooter category. And the term has also been applied to scripted events in FPS games such as Call of Duty. Vertically scrolling shooters. These feature actions that is viewed from above and scrolls up, or occasionally down, the screen. Horizontal shooters feature action that is viewed side-on and scrolls horizontally. Isometrically scrolling shooters. A small number of scrolling shooters, such as Sega's Zaxxon, feature an isometric point of view. Multi-directional shooters features 360-degree movement where the protagonist may rotate and move in any direction. Multi-directional shooters with one joystick for movement and one joystick for firing in any direction independent of movement are called twin-stick shooters. Bullet Hell. This is a shoot 'em up in which the entire screen is often almost completely filled with enemy bullets. This type is also known as curtain fire, manic shooters, or maniac shooters. This style of game originated in the mid 1990s and is an offshoot of scrolling shooters. Cute them up, or cute 'em ups, feature brightly colored graphics depicting surreal settings and animals. Cute 'em ups tend to have an unusual, often completely bizarre opponents for the player to fight, with key games in the genre being Parodius, Cotton, Twinbee, and Harmful Park. Some cute 'em ups may employ overtly sexual characters and innuendo. And finally, there are run and guns. This describes a shoot 'em up in which the protagonist fights on foot, usually with the ability to jump. Examples include Ikari Warriors, Contra, and Metal Slug. Run and gun games may use side-scrolling, vertical scrolling, or isometric viewpoints and may feature multi-directional movement. So, there you go. That is the shoot 'em up for the shooter games. Moving along, we've got ourselves the shooting gallery subgenre. The shooting gallery games include light gun games, although many can also be played using a regular joypad and an on-screen cursor to signify where the bullets are being aimed. For those of you who don't know what a light gun is, think of the original NES Duck Hunt with the little gun peripheral that you got added. So a light gun is you point at the screen, and when you pull the trigger for one frame, the entire screen goes black, except for where the gun is pointing. Because where the gun is pointing, there is a white dot or a white pixel. So every time you pull the trigger, it flashes black with only that white dot remaining. And if that white dot happens to overlap where the duck is, it's a successful hit. If you miss, it's an unsuccessful hit. That's why every time you shoot it, it seems to like flash for a second, because it is flashing for a nanosecond. So that's a light gun. Let's see. So when these debuted, they were typically played from a first-person perspective, with enemy fire that occurred anywhere on the screen, damaging or killing the player. As they evolved away from the use of light guns, the player came to be represented by an on-screen avatar, usually someone on the bottom of the screen, who could easily move and avoid enemy fire while returning fire. These sort of shooters almost always utilize horizontal scrolling to the right to indicate level progression, with enemies appearing in waves or predestined locations in the background or from the sides. One of the earliest examples of the 1985 arcade game Shootout, produced by Data East. A specific subgenre of this type of game is the Cabal shooter, named for the game Cabal, in which the player controls an on-screen avatar that can run and often jump around the screen in addition to being able to aim their gun. Other games in the subgenre include Blood Bros, Dynamite Duke, NAM 1975, Wild Guns, and Sin and Punishment. Light gun games became more prevalent and started to make use of fully 3D backgrounds, such as Time Crisis or House of the Dead series. These sorts of games fell out of popular production, but many like Blood Bros still have their fan base today. Other notable games of this category include Operation Wolf and Laser Invasion. All right, just to make sure. Okay, I was right. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't saying something wrong when I was talking about the light gun. So it is the NES Zapper. That is probably one of the earliest light guns peripherals, but they have other light guns. I've never seen any of the other ones outside of arcades. You know, you've got those arcade games where you're aiming the gun and everything. Yeah, those would be light guns. Next up is the more specifically, actually looking at the light gun shooter now, apparently, other than Oh, because shooting gallery included light gun games. This is going to just look more at the light gun shooter. So, light gun shooter, also called light gun game or simply gun game, is a shooter video game genre in which the primary design element is aiming and shooting with a gun-shaped controller. Light gun shooters revolve around the protagonist shooting targets, either antagonists or inanimate objects. Unfortunately, you cannot shoot the antagonist in Duck Hunt because it's the dog who is constantly laughing at you. Light gun shooters generally feature action or horror themes, and some may employ a humorous periodic treatment of these conventions. These games typically feature on-rail movement, which gives the player control only over aiming. The protagonist's other movements are determined by the game. Games featuring this device are also sometimes termed rail shooters, though this term is also applied to games of other genres in which on-rails movement is a feature. Some, particularly later, games give the player greater control over movement, and in still some others, the protagonist does not move at all. Light gun shooters employ light gun controllers, so named because they function through the use of a light sensor. Mechanical games using light guns existed since the 1930s, though they operated differently from those used in video games. Throughout the 1970s, mechanical games were replaced by electronic video games, and in the 1980s, popular light gun shooters such as Duck Hunt emerged. The genre was most popular in the 1990s, subsequent to the release of Virtua Cop, the formula of which was later improved upon by Time Crisis. The genre is less popular in the new millennium, as well as being hampered by compatibility issues, but retains a niche appeal for fans of old-school gameplay. So let's take a quick look at the design. Targets in light gun shooters may be threatening antagonists such as criminals, terrorists, or zombies, or they may be inanimate objects such as apples or bottles, or they could just be flying ducks. Although these games may be played without a light gun, the use of more conventional input methods have been deemed inferior. Light gun shooters typically feature generic action or horror themes, though some later games employ more humorous self-referential styles. Light gun shooters primarily revolve around shooting large numbers of enemies attacking in waves. The protagonist may be required to defend himself by taking cover or by shooting incoming thrown weapons such as axes or grenades. The player may also compete against the clock, however, with some games also featuring boss fights. Games may also reward the player for accurate shooting with extra points, power-ups, or secrets. Games which do not pit the player against antagonists instead feature elaborate challenges, construed mainly from inanimate objects, testing the player's speed and accuracy. More conventional games may feature these types of challenges as minigames. Light gun shooters typically feature on-rail movement, which gives the player no control over the direction the protagonist moves in. The player only has control over aiming and shooting. Some games, however, may allow the protagonist to take cover at the push of a button. Other games may eschew on-rail movements altogether and allow the player to move the protagonist freely around the game's environments. Still, others may feature static environment. Light gun shooters use a first-person perspective for aiming, though some games may allow the player to switch to a third person in order to maneuver the protagonist. So there you go. Up until we were talking about it, I was just like, I don't know any other light gun games other than Duck Hunt. And then as we're reading, I'm just like, oh yeah, every arcade game that uses a gun peripheral would be a light gun game for the use of light guns. I never played those because I have bad accuracy. All right. Moving on to the first-person shooter. So first-person shooters, or FPS, is a video game subgenre centered on gun and other weapon-based combat in a first-person perspective. That is, the player experiences the action through the eyes of the protagonist. The genre shares common traits with other shooter games, which in turn makes it fall under the heading of an action game. Since the genre's inception, advanced 3D and pseudo 3D graphics have challenged hardware development, and multiplayer gaming has been integral. The first-person shooter genre has been traced as far back as Wolfenstein 3D, which has been credited with creating the genre's basic archetype, upon which subsequent titles were based. One such title and the progenitor of the genre's wider mainstream acceptance and popularity was Doom. one of the most influential games of the genre. For some years, the Doom clone was used to designate the genre due to Doom's influence. Corridor shooter was another common name for the genre in its early years, since processing limitations of the era's hardware meant that most of the action had to take place in enclosed areas such as cramped spaces like corridors and tunnels. 1998's Half-Life, along with the 2004 sequel Half-Life 2, enhanced the narrative and puzzle elements. In 1993, the Half-Life mod Counter-Strike, or 1999, the Half-Life mod Counter-Strike, I don't know why I said 93, it was 99, was released, and together with Doom is perhaps one of the most influential first-person shooters. GoldenEye 007, released in 97, was a landmark first-person shooter for home consoles, while the Halo series heightened the console's commercial and critical appeal as a platform for first-person shooter titles. In the 21st century, the first-person shooter is the most commercially viable video game genre, and in 2016, shooters accounted for over 27% of all video game sales. Damn. So first-person shooters are a type of shooter game, obviously featuring that first-person point of view with which the player sees the action through the eyes of the player character. They differ from third-person shooters in that, in a third-person shooter, the player can see, usually from behind, the character they are controlling. The primary design element is combat, mainly involving firearms. First-person shooter games are also often categorized as being distinct from light gun shooters, which is we just talked about. Because obviously the light gun uses a peripheral, and there are peripherals in some first-person shooters. However, for the most part, because in some light guns, you're playing in the first-person view. However, light guns use the peripheral, and first-person shooters do not use the peripheral, typically. So an FPS will use a conventional input device for movement and aiming. And the other big difference is the fact that light gun shooters use on-rails or scripted movements, whereas a first-person shooter gives the player 100% control over their actions, their movements, everything. So those are the big differences between the two. You can have a first-person shooter in a light gun, but you cannot have a light gun in a first-person shooter, if that makes sense. The first-person shooter may be considered a distinct genre itself or a type of shooter game, in turn a subgenre of a wider action game genre. Following the release of Doom in 1993, games in this style were commonly termed Doom clones. Over time, this term has largely been just replaced with first-person shooter. Wolfenstein 3D in 1992, the year before Doom, has been credited with introducing the genre, but critics have since identified similar, though less advanced games developed as far back as 1973. There are occasional disagreements regarding the specific design elements which constitute a first-person shooter. For example, Deus Ex or BioShock may be considered as first-person shooters, but may also be considered role-playing video games as they borrow from this genre extensively. Certain puzzle games like Portal are also called first-person shooters, but lack any direct combat or shooting element, instead using the first-person perspective to help immerse players within the game to help solve puzzles. Some commentators extend the definition to include combat flight simulators where the cockpit or vehicle takes place of hands and weapons. I mean, I would say Portal's a first-person shooter. You still use that first-person... I mean, you are shooting your portal gun, and you're using that first-person aim for it. It's really difficult to say, because, right. I mean, when you say FPS, you're thinking, well, some people are thinking frames per second, but for first-person shooter FPS... You're thinking that first-person perspective where you're running around, aiming and shooting, right? That's kind of Portal. But also Deus Ex and BioShock will still fall into that category. I would say BioShock is in terms of, its core elements and mechanics, it's a hybrid FPS RPG. BioShock, I would say, is a hybrid FPS puzzle. But, there is no game that is 100% only one thing. It will be mixed in with other genres because that's exactly what we do. We put in things that's going to be fun. So, yeah. So, game design. Like many shooters, exactly, it would be very boring if we didn't have multiple different genres or elements encompassing within that. So, that's why everything's a hybrid now. Again, game design. Like most shooter games, first-person shooters involve an avatar, one or more ranged weapons, and a varying number of enemies. Because they take place in a 3D environment, these games tend to be somewhat more realistic than 2D shooter games, and have more accurate representations of gravity, lighting, sound, and collisions. First-person shooters played on personal computers are most often controlled with a combination of a keyboard and mouse. The system has been claimed as superior to that found in console games, which frequently use two analog sticks, one used for running and sidestepping, the other for looking and aiming. It is common to display the character's hands and weaponry in the main view, with a heads-up display showing health, ammunition, and location details. Often it is possible to overlay a map of the surrounding area. Combat and power-ups. First-person shooters often focus on action gameplay with fast pace and bloody firefights, though some place a greater emphasis on narrative, problem-solving, and logic puzzles. In addition to shooting, melee combat may also be used extensively. In some games, melee weapons are especially powerful, a reward for the risk the player must take in maneuvering his character into close proximity to the enemy. In other situations, a melee weapon may be less effective but necessary as a last resort. Tactical shooters are more realistic and require teamwork and strategy to succeed. The player often commands a squad of characters, which may be controlled by the game or by human teammates. Funny. Every time I play BioShock, I only use melee weapons. Screw using ranged weapons. Who needs them? I can just beat people with a lead pipe. First-person shooters typically give players a choice of weapons, which have a large impact on how the player will approach the game. Some game designs have realistic models of actual existing or historical weapons, incorporating their rate of fire, magazine size, ammunition amount, recoil, and accuracy. Other first-person shooter games may incorporate imaginative variations of weapons, including future prototypes, alien technology, scenario-defined weaponry, and or utilizing a wide array of projectiles, from industrial labor tools to laser, energy, plasma, rocket, and grenade launchers or crossbows. These many variations may also be applied to the tossing animations of grenades, rocks, spears, and the like. Also, more unconventional modes of destruction may be employed from the viewable user's hands, such as flames, electricity, telekinesis, or other supernatural abilities and traps. However, designers often allow characters to carry varying multiples of weapons with little to no reduction in speed or mobility. Or perhaps more realistically, a pistol or smaller device in a long rifle, or even limiting the player to only one weapon at a time. These are often options to trade up, upgrade, or swap out in most games. Thus, the standards of realism vary between design elements. The protagonist can generally be healed and rearmed by means of items such as first aid kits, simply by walking over them. Some games allow players to accumulate experience points similar to those found in RPGs, which can unlock new weapons and abilities. Level design. First-person shooters may be structurally composed of levels or use the technique of a continuous narrative in which the game never leaves the first-person perspective. Others feature large sandbox environments, which are not divided into levels and can be explored freely. In first-person shooters, protagonists interact with the environment to varying degrees, from basics such as using doors to problem-solving puzzles based on a variety of interactive objects. See, right here, everything they're talking about with FPS, with problem-solving puzzles and interactive objects, it's hard to say that Portal doesn't fit in here. In some games, the player can damage the environment, also to varying degrees. One common device is the use of barrels containing explosive material, which the player can shoot, destroying himself and harming nearby enemies. Other games feature environments which are extensively destructible, allowing for additional visual effects. The game world will often make use of science fiction, historic, particularly World War II, or modern military themes, such as antagonists as aliens, monsters, terrorists, and soldiers of various types. Games feature multiple difficulty settings. In higher modes, enemies are tougher, more aggressive, and do more damage, and power-ups are limited. In easier modes, the player can succeed through reaction times alone. On more difficult settings, it is often necessary to memorize the level through trial and error. Multiplayer. First-person shooters may feature a multiplayer mode, taking place on specialized levels. Some game modes designed specifically for multiplayer gaming and have a very limited single-player mode in which the player competes against game-controlled characters termed bots. Massively multiplayer online first-person shooters allow thousands of players to compete at once in a persistent world. Large-scale multiplayer games allow multiple squads with leaders issuing commands and a commander controlling the team's overall strategies. Multiplayer games have a variety of different styles of match. Are there actually MMO FPSs? I've never heard of an MMO FPS. If you guys know of one or could quickly Google one, actually, I could probably look one up real quick right here just by opening this. List of MMO FPS. Dust 514, Firefall, Global Agenda, Hellgate London. These are all games that no longer exist too. Huxley, Mag, PlanetSide, Tabula Rasa. Those games are all done. The only MMO FPSs that still exist today is Neocron, PlanetSide 2, and World War II Online. That is not considered an MMO FPS, apparently. I don't know what Destiny would count as. Oh, there we go then. Destiny would be considered. Maybe nobody bothered to update that listing I was looking at because nobody cares about them. I have Destiny. I didn't really enjoy it too much. Continuing on, the classic types are the deathmatch and its team deathmatch variant, in which players score points by killing other player characters, and capture the flag, in which teams attempt to penetrate the opposing base, capture a flag, and return to their own base, whilst preventing the other team from doing the same. Other game modes may involve attempting to capture any bases or areas of the map, attempting to take hold of an object for as long as possible while evading other players, or deathmatch variations involving limited lives, or in which players fight over a particularly potent power-up. These match types may also be customizable, allowing the players to vary weapons, health, and power-ups found on the map, as well as victory criteria. Games may allow players to choose between various classes, each with its own strengths, weakness, equipment, and roles within a team. And finally, free-to-play. There are many free-to-play first-person shooters on the market now, including Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, Apex Legends, TF2, PlanetSide 2. Some games are released as free-to-play as their intended business model and can be highly profitable. League of Legends earned $2 billion in 2017 alone. But others, such as Eternal Crusade, begin their lives as paid games and become free-to-play later to reach a wider audience after an initially disappointing reception. Some player communities complain about freemium first-person shooters, fearing that they create unbalanced games, but many game designers have tweaked prices in response to criticisms, and players can usually get the same benefits by playing longer rather than playing. Yeah, that's the one thing I don't like about, quote, free-to-play, if I can go off on a tangent on free-to-play, is the game is made to be played paid. Yes, you can make it so that you can get everything for free if you want. You have a way of getting paid currency slowly. You can get paid currency, or you can get lesser items of the same type just by playing for hours and hours and hours. But what would take somebody 10 hours to beat a mission could take you 40, 50, 60 because you aren't equipped properly. It's just, it's still majorly unbalanced. And that's why I don't like a lot of free-to-play games. So, all right, moving on to the third-person shooter. The TPS. Subgenre of 3D shooter games in which the gameplay consists primarily of shooting, very closely related to the first-person shooters. However, the player character is visible on the screen during play. The camera is typically set behind you and above, so like the camera would be like there. If I were a third-person video game, my camera would be right here as the player is controlling me from that viewpoint. So, a third-person shooter is a game structured around shooting in which the player can see the avatar on screen in a third-person view. Third-person shooter is a game where instead of seeing the games through the main character's eyes, you see the main character moving and shooting in a game, and the game is specifically focused on shooting. So, would you consider playing the Huntress or the Death Slinger in Dead by Daylight a first-person shooter? Because you are controlling the action and you've got ranged weapons in your hand. Oh, and Vommy Mommy. Okay, anyway, design. It's a 3D... It is a third-person shooter is a 3D genre that has grown to prominence in the early and mid-2000s, especially on consoles. It features the shooting elements of a first-person shooting, sometimes combining these with jumping and climbing elements of puzzle-based games and brawlers. Third-person shooter games sometimes incorporate an aim assist feature to compensate for the difficulty of aiming from a third-person camera. Many include some form of first-person view, which allows precise shooting and looking around at environment features that are otherwise hidden from the default camera. In early examples of the genre, the player will often be required to stand still to use first-person view, but newer titles allow the player to play like an FPS. So yeah, some games allow FPS, TPS to switch modes. A good example is actually, what's that game called? The Evil Within 2 got an update that allowed you to play the game from a first-person perspective. Just randomly, instead of being a third-person game, they switched to a first-person. Or was it first-person to third-person? I don't remember. It was one of the two. The relationship to first-person shooters. These games are closely related to first-person shooters, which also tie the perspective of the player to an avatar, distinguished only in a minor change of position of the camera. While the first-person perspective allows players to aim and shoot without their avatar blocking the way, the third-person shooter shows the protagonist from an over-the-shoulder shot or behind-the-back perspective. Thus, third-person perspective allows the game designer to create a more strongly characterized avatar and directs the player's attention as in watching a film. In contrast, a first-person perspective provides the player with greater immersion into the game universe. This difference in perspective has some effects on gameplay. Third-person shooters allow players to see the areas surrounding the avatar more clearly. This viewpoint facilitates more interaction between the character and their surrounding environment, such as the use of tactical cover system in Gears of War or navigating tight quarters. Gears of War is also a series on my list to eventually play on stream. As such, the third-person perspective is better for interacting with objects in the game world, such as jumping on platforms, engaging in close combat, or driving a vehicle. However, the third-person perspective can interfere with tasks that require fine aiming. Third-person shooters sometimes compensate for the distinct perspective by designing larger, more spacious environments than first-person shooters. The boundaries between third-person and first-person shooters are not always clear. For example, many third-person shooters allow the player to use first-person viewpoint for challenges that require precise aiming, while others simply allow a player to freely switch between first and third-person perspective at will. The FPS shooter Halo Combat Evolved was actually designed as a third-person shooter, but added a first-person perspective to improve the interface for aiming and shooting. Game switches to a third-person viewpoint when the avatar is piloting a vehicle. This combination of first-person aiming and third-person driving has since been used in other video games. Metroid Prime is another first-person shooter that switches to a third-person perspective when rolling around the environment using the morph ball. Many games in the genre, such as Arma series and its descendants, including the popular battle royale shooter PUBG, allows players to freely transition between first and third person at will. Alexander R. Galloway writes that the real-time over-the-shoulder tracking shots of Gus Van Sant's Elephant evoke third-person shooter games like Max Payne, a close cousin of the FPS, or the FPS. All right. Next up is Arena. Oh my God, what happened to my voice? Next up is the Arena shooter. Arena shooters are multiplayer shooters that feature fast-paced gameplay that emphasizes quick speed and agile movement. These games will usually feature weapons that don't require to reload with continuous ammo, floaty gravity, and jumps, and a very fast character movement. Example of these include the Quake and Unreal series, more specifically Quake 3 Arena and Unreal Tournament, which first pioneered the genre. These games are also characterized by their focus on multiplayer only, with most titles not even featuring a single-player mode. While the genre hit its peak in popularity in the late 90s and early 2000s, they have become less popular in recent times, with other shooter genres rising in prominence, with many of the newest arena shooters being released and developed by indie studios like Reflex Arena. That's all we have on arena shooters. Next up is the hero shooter. I've never actually heard of the hero shooter subgenre. A hero shooter is a subgenre of shooter games that cover both first and third-person genres. The character emphasizes hero characters that have unique abilities and or weapons that are specific to them. Hero shooters are a variation of multiplayer first or third-person shooters where players split among more teams and select from pre-designed hero characters that each possess unique attributes, skills, weapons, and other passive active abilities. Hero shooters strongly encourage teamwork between players on a team, guiding players to select effective combination of hero characters and coordinate the use of hero abilities during a match. Hero shooters take many of their design elements from older class-based shooters and multiplayer online battle arena games. Okay, I know what they are then. Cool. The origins of hero shooters can be traced back to early tactical shooters that featured class-based playable characters in multiplayer games. Games like Battlefield 1942 and Team Fortress Classic featured specific roles that a player could select that would come with their own unique abilities and sometimes specific weapons that were not available to the other classes. So basically, Overwatch. While the majority of tactical shooters were the main game in the genre that features some form of class-based mechanics, other shooters also featured the same gameplay style and had their own take, such as Star Wars Battlefront and Conquer, Live and Reloaded. It wouldn't be until the release of TF2, Team Fortress 2, in 2007 that the main framework and inspiration for the subgenre would be established. While Team Fortress 2 did feature the same class-based system as its predecessor, it made a huge departure by making each specific class its own unique character, along with specific personality and appearance to them. This made the roles more fleshed out and feel more like a real person rather than a nameless playable character. The subgenre would not see its official birth and rise in popularity until the release of Overwatch in 2016. Oh my god, it's only been 4 years? Heavily inspired by TF2 and MOBAs, the game featured unique characters that all had their own unique backstory and abilities that were specific to them. What marked the difference between hero shooters and traditional class-based shooters was the emphasis of the story and the world that the games were set in, and flesh out characters that the players could control. Rather than just being nameless nobodies, everyone had a whole story behind them that fit into a bigger narrative as a whole. The rise in popularity was soon followed by a flood of similar games like Lawbreakers and Paladins. Current popular hero shooters include Overwatch, Apex Legends, Valorant, Rogue Company, and Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege. Let's see. Tactical shooters. Excuse me while I drink again. Holy crap, my throat. A tactical shooter is a subgenre of shooter game that covers both the first-person and third-person shooter genres. These games simulate realistic combat, thus making tactics and caution more important than quick reflexes in other action games. Tactical shooters involve military combat, are sometimes known as soldier simulators or milsim. According to IGN, tactical shooters are about caution, care, cooperation, coordination, planning, and pacing. In these games, making decisive pushes, quick moves for cover, strategic retreats, and last-ditch grabs at the gold are not only important to success, but balanced in such a way that they become enjoyable activities to play. David Treharn of GameSpew identifies 4 criteria for what qualifies as a tactical shooter. Mainly, you're looking for the use of realistic constraints of player movement, realistically simulated ballistic inaccuracy, squad-based or multiple approach style accessibility, and a low tolerance or low health realistic damage model. Basically, you usually move slower than most shooters, your accuracy is much slower, and bullet drops over a distance. You usually have a squad to command, and all of you only being able to take 2 or 3 shots before dying. Tactical shooters are designed for realism. It is not unusual for players to be killed with a single bullet, and thus players must be more cautious than in other shooter games. The emphasis on realistic modeling of weapons and power-ups are often more limited than in other action games. This restrains the individual heroism seen in other shooter games, and thus tactics become more important. Overall, the style of play is typically slower than other action games due to significantly more punishing gameplay. Jumping techniques are sometimes de-emphasized in order to promote realism, with some games going so far as to omit a jump button. And in contrast to games that emphasize running and shooting, the tactical shooter requires more caution and patience, making use of cover and avoid being caught out in the open. Plus, tactical shooters are usually designed so that shooting becomes inaccurate while running, while increasing accuracy while in a crouching or a prone stance. Players often have the choice of shooting from the hip, which is referred to as hippie, which is less accurate but gives a wider view of area, or using the scope iron sights for better zoom and accuracy, but at the penalty of restricted view. Some tactical shooters, such as the Infiltration mod for the Unreal Tournament, even lack the crosshair seen in other first-person shooters in order to achieve a high degree of realism. Many tactical shooters make use of group-based combat, where the player character is supported by other teammates. While early tactical shooters had simple computer-controlled teammates who offered support fire, the artificial intelligence in later games has evolved with more complex teammate responses such as cover fire mechanics. In games with a sufficiently robust artificial intelligence, the player character is able to issue commands to other computer-controlled characters. Some games in the genre allow players to plan their team's movements before a mission, with the artificial intelligence then follows. Many games also offer a multiplayer online play, allowing human players to strategize and coordinate via a headset. Team-based tactics are emphasized more than other shooter games, and thus accurate aiming and quick reflexes are not always sufficient for victory. The level design usually reflects the game's settings. For example, the player may play the role of SWAT police fighting terrorists or other criminals, or may engage in military combat in real-world conflicts as either battlefield soldiers or special forces commandos. Some games take place in entirely fictional universes. Excuse me. and incorporate elements of sci-fi. Each level will have different objectives. Although some levels may simply feature that the player defeat the enemy, other levels may challenge the player with objectives, such as escorting a VIP safely to a specific location, or planting a demolition charge on a target. Levels are also designed with checkpoints or alternate routes, as run and gun assaults are often met with heavy resistance. It becomes important to exploit a superior position and or take the enemy by surprise and even evading them entirely. Weapons. Tactical shooters often feature a wide variety of weapons modeled upon actual firearms, being more realistic than run and gun shooters. For instance, the Brothers in Arms series is unique in that since the game takes place in World War II, development team Gearbox Software made sure to actually portray the weapon accurately by adding realistic recoil, motion blur, and the feeling of being suppressed. They did this by actually testing the weapons themselves and hiring military consultants in the development. However, simulating actual combat is often sacrificed in favor of balance as well as playability. There are often considerable modifications to in-game weapons and ballistics from their real-life counterparts in order to ensure balance in multiplayer. For instance, Counter-Strike and other games allow the player to survive multiple bullet hits to the torso, ignoring the bullet resistance of different types of ballistic vests, and even more to the legs, rarely armored in real life, while registering an automatic kill for melee hits to the back, whether punches or knife stabs, and headshots, including a pistol shot to the back of the head, even if the target is wearing a combat helmet. In contrast to run and gun shooters such as Quake, in which allows players to carry full arsenals, tactical shooters place considerable restrictions on what the player may be equipped with. So players have to carefully select weapons according to situations and or their role in the team. Half-Life Counter-Strike system of allowing a primary weapon, such as an assault rifle, shotgun, submachine gun, sniper rifle, or light machine gun, and a secondary weapon, pistol or shotgun, has been followed by many other shooters like Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. Wielding or carrying heavy weapons such as sniper rifles and machine guns often incur a movement penalty over lighter weapons such as submachine guns and pistols. Players often find loopholes in the system such as Half-Life Counter-Strike, where they would switch their firearms to a knife in order to run faster. Fair. Akimbo pistols, or dual wielding of pistols, and submachine guns, despite being ineffective and inaccurate in real life, is frequently featured in tactical shooters, likely as a homage to films. The Desert Eagle, or Deagle as many people know it, despite its heavyweight recoil and limited magazine capability, making it unsuitable for actual military and special forces applications, is frequently found in many tactical shooters as a high-powered handgun option. Numerous fictional depictions of the Soviet-Russian armed forces, such as Call of Duty Modern Warfare, show them armed with AK-47s as their standard issue assault rifles, a long-standing anachronism thanks to the AK-47's iconic status, despite the Soviets having actually replaced them with the AK-74 in the 1970s. Examples of these elements are in Counter-Strike and Call of Duty Modern Warfare. And of course, there's explosives. Due to the problem of grenade spamming, the effective explosions are often toned down and or only 1 to 2 grenades are allowed to be carried. Cooking a grenade by releasing the lever to partially burn the fuse before throwing it to make it harder for an opponent to catch it or run away is discouraged in real life since fuses are imprecise. Nonetheless, this is still an extremely common Hollywood tactic in video games and movies. You know, you just pull the pin, you release it, wait a couple seconds, and then throw it so that it hopefully explodes on contact, where in reality, you're going to pull that pin, you're going to hold it in your hand for a second, and then it blows up in your face. In first-person shooter video games of the mid-1990s or mid-2000s, such as Quake and Unreal Tournament, the rocket launcher, which fires dumbfire unguided missiles, was one of the most prominent multiplayer weapons, which largely overshadowed the other weapons available to players. This was because the rocket launcher had a quick reload. The rocket traveled faster, the warhead had devastating splash damage, which could severely injure or kill whatever the missile detonated upon, either if it was on the player or anywhere nearby the player, and the blast force could propel and disorient the target. Experienced players could take advantage of the blast and risk some injury by rocket jumping. The Rocket Arena mod was created, which focused upon the use of the rocket launcher as the primary weapon. The rocket launcher remained in the sequels, but the attributes were toned down somewhat. Lastly, players could carry dozens of rockets, which encourages their prolificate use. By contrast, shooters such as Call of Duty do not use the term rocket launcher. While they have similar concept rockets or weapons, they are modeled after real-life equivalents such as the rocket-propelled grenade, bazooka, and FIM-92 Stinger. Several with specific applications against vehicles rather than personnel. These rocket weapons have very scarce ammo and long reload time, reflecting the limited situations that they are utilized, as well as discouraging reckless player usage. There is a game that I'm trying to think of. There's a game focused completely on the idea of rockets. I don't remember what it's called. Let's see. I don't remember what it's called. It's a game all about using rocket launchers and just shooting people, basically. Oh, well. Moving on. Next up, we've got the loot shooter. Loot shooters are shooting games where the player's overarching goal is the accumulation of loot, weapons, equipment, armor, accessories, and resources, aka any game that I play where I can get my hands on things and then I just keep accumulating them more and more and more and more and more. To achieve this, players complete tasks, frames as quests, missions, or campaigns are rewarded with better weapons, gear, and accessories as a result, with the qualities and attributes and perks of such gear generated randomly following certain rarity scales, also known as loot tables. Better gear allows players to take on more difficult missions with potentially more powerful rewards, forming the game's compulsion loop. Loot shooters are inspired by similar loot-based action RPG games such as Diablo. Examples of loot shooters include the Borderlands franchise, Warframe, Destiny 2, Tom Clancy's The Division, and the sequel, and Anthem. That's all I have on loot shooters. And finally, the last thing for shooter games is other. There is artillery games, which have been described as a shooting game, but they are also classified as a strategy game. So we will go into that when we get to the strategy video game subgenre. Yeah, we don't have time to jump into the next one. So, yeah. Apparently, shooter games took up another hour of our time. So, maybe next week, we'll be able to get through fighting, beat 'em up. We definitely can get through fighting and beat 'em up. Stealth, and maybe even survival. Yeah. I think we can get through 4 subgenres next time. Oh, yeah. Shooters were definitely a full hour just on their own. So much talking. And I almost lost my voice halfway through it. Somehow. So, yeah. I think we are going to leave it right here. And we will pick up again with this next week. So I'd like to say thank you, everybody, for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. Yeah, until the next time, everybody, stay funky, people.